The impact of war on India is multi-layered. India and Russia have shared a special relationship since the Cold War, and Moscow remains India's biggest arms supplier. In terms of crude oil supplies, it's become a more significant oil supplier than it was before the Ukraine war. Perhaps this is because of the price advantage. India can now get Russian oil at 30% discount, and as the Indian External Affairs Minister has made it very clear that India views everything from the prism of its own national interest, and what is of Western concern is not necessarily impinging on India. It should not be allowed to impinge on India's national interests. So India is protecting its energy security by buying the Russian oil despite the American and Western sanctions. Stockholm Peace Research Institute has estimated that between 2011 and 2021, in a decade, Russia accounted for 60% of weapons imported by India. Hence, India cannot escape the serious fallout of this war. There have been concerns that the Russians are themselves running short of war material. They have to worry about spares of their tanks, planes, etc. So they are importing drones from Korea and Iran. So under these circumstances, Indians think that the Russian supplies can remain uninterrupted for maintenance of the weapon system which they bought from Russia. On the sidelines of the September Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Samarkand, Prime Minister Modi told the Russian President, I know that today's era is not an era of war. This perhaps is the most explicit signaling by the Indian Prime Minister to the Russian friends that continued Russian acts of war in Ukraine are not acceptable. India doesn't approve of this. If the Russians have an outstanding issue with Ukraine, this should be settled diplomatically, not through military means. It's been difficult to maintain a non-aligned stance and a tightrope balancing act. India cannot alienate Russia. It cannot afford to let Russia go entirely to the Chinese sphere of influence. It's interesting that people are not talking of Chinese sphere of influence, not the Russian sphere of influence to which China belongs. India definitely doesn't want the world to be divided again into two hostile blocs. India continues to rely heavily on West for its technology, especially high-tech, but the West has been reluctant to, or less forthcoming than Russians, to give the high-tech arms to India to secure its borders. It doesn't want to antagonize China beyond a certain measure. It wants to put India in front to countervail the Chinese aggression in South China Sea, in Pacific, in South Asia, but very little concrete assistance in terms of military hardware of the first-rate variety is available. The oil and defense, there was an initial criticism by European Union members, but the Indian External Affairs Minister made it very clear that India would buy cheap oil from wherever it gets according to its interest. It certainly is not going to let Western worldview impinge on its national interest. With India at the helm of G20, the West might lobby India to play a bigger role and criticize the Russians.